this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
In this episode of the World War II podcast, we're exploring a remarkable personal story from the closing stages of the Second World War. I'm joined by Bernd Häber to talk about his grandfather, Fritz, a German soldier who became a prisoner of war in American hands at the end of the conflict. During his 16 months in captivity, Fritz kept a detailed diary, not only reflecting on life in the prison camp, but also recounting his wartime experiences and the personal background that shaped him. The diary is now available as a book. Fritz Häber, The Complete Diary, 16 Months in an American POW Camp. It's an honest account that offers a rare insight into the mindset of a German soldier grappling with defeat, reflection, and the realities of war. Bernd, thanks for joining me. So let's start with the Häber family. Who were Fritz's parents? What was his family background?
So he was born in 1910. So let me walk you through his life. His life spanned in terms of German history. So in 1910, he's born. So Germany is still an empire, right? With an emperor. So then 1914 through 1918 is World War I. So he lives through as a toddler, as a child. He's not serving, of course, as a soldier at all, but he experienced that. And then, of course, World War I ends in 1918. The Weimar Republic starts in the 1920-ish, all the way through 1933. So he lives through that as a young man. In the book, he writes about apprenticeship as a blacksmith and all the various jobs that he gets as a young man. And in 1933 comes along, of course, Hitler comes to power. And so he lives through those 12 years of fascism or World War II. 1945, the World War ends. Luckily, of course, he survives the POW camp. 1946, comes home to Zwickau, in a small town in Saxony, rejoins his family, and then continues to live in East Germany, as we know it today. There were two Germanys out of World War II, West Germany, East Germany, all the way through 1990 or 1989 when the Berlin Wall comes down. And then 1990, reunification. And so he passes away, I have to double check, 1996 or 1998. So he lives through these 6 periods of German history, not necessarily active, but of course, the primary years was the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s. What a life, having experienced that.
What's interesting is you kind of think of these breaks in history that causes great ruptions. And you go, the First War, yeah, he's been through the First World War. You go, 1933, it's almost like a history lesson. Yeah, he's been through 1933. Communism and the Cold War, yes, he's been through that and the Second World War as well. At all these big points that you almost put in textbooks, he's lived through it all of an age that he could remember.
And for him, so you ask about his parents. So his parents were influential in the way of, and he writes it in a book, I didn't know until I read it, that they had at home 3 weekly or monthly news or daily newspapers, so he could read them all as a young man. One was conservative, whatever the title or the label is, right? So read through this and try to understand how these conservatives look at the world in the 1920s. Then somewhere the more liberal piece of, social democratic type of views of the world. And then more the left-wing communist newspaper of flyers that they distributed. So he was able from young age to look at the whole world, not just from one perspective. So those are his parents, and they encouraged him, helped him get the apprenticeship as a blacksmith. His parents said, you need to go for it, do it. It's a real job. You can do it. Another influence were his 2 brothers, 2 older brothers, Kurt and Otto, who both were killed in World War II, but they both joined the communist movement already in the 1920s. And according to some documentation I have in the book, Fritz joins them early on, late 20s, early 30s in the sports. He was a
wrestler.
Thank you. Yeah. So he joined the sports. So of course that gave him, physical strength. And also, I'm not sure if he ever joined a military kind of communist group to fight for something, but at least he was physically well equipped for what's coming. But his two brothers really influenced him politically, and then he started distributing leaflets, and he was incarcerated in 1933 when the Gestapo came to his house and picked him up.
What's interesting about that whole idea of him, he is a communist, is the fact that, when you learn about the Weimar Republic, you hear about the left and the right, and he's there actually taking a side, but not not the National Socialist side. So what was his incarceration like by 1933? He's picked up quite early. If they've only just come to power if they're rounding him up in 1933.
It's a funny story, and I have some documentation on letters and that he wrote outside of the diary. Kurt and Otto were kind of journeymen. So they were building houses and construction workers. So then eventually, of course, they traveled just southern Germany, wherever they could find a job. So his brother, I believe, Kurt, ended up in Dresden, but they were active in a communist movement. But then he was already protesting, I said carefully, protesting the new regime. And so he was in hiding in Dresden. So they went home to get Fritz from his home or workplace and put him in, and the paper says, concentration camp. So it's a small town at Zwickau. The castle itself was a concentration camp, but not in the sense as we all know concentration. It was just a prison, basically, but already says concentration camp. And the reason why they charged him, Fritz, with whatever charge, treason kind of thing, because they wanted to get to court. And then, long story, he was forced to write a postcard to Dresden, and then they followed the address and finally got hold of court. Court gets incarcerated, has to spend 2 years in prison, and then they send Fritz home. So that was his first time to realize how tough it is, what could happen. In his book, he says, the circumstances can just pick you up, you have to deal with it. And all of a sudden, he spends 1 year, almost a year, in already prison. And I have the diary of his mother, my great-grandmother, when she writes, I don't know where Fritz is. They've picked him up. I have no idea. And after, a few weeks and months, she figured out, oh, he's in prison. Okay. It's just mind-boggling how, quickly, life can change to the worst.
I wonder how much that, marked his copybook, how much that affected him before the outbreak of war in his simple daily life, having that taint on his character of being imprisoned as a communist, or if it just gets overlooked and is washed away.
So he's the father of my father, Herbert, and my father was born in 1930. So he had already, I have to go back to all the kids had, in the end, had 6 or 7 kids. But my father was already a baby, so 2 years old. Maybe his brother or siblings already were born. So there were maybe 2 or 3 kids at home, babies, small kids. And so he's away for a whole year. So his wife, Linda, had to deal with the kids. And of course, the parents helped and stuff. So it was really hard for him to do anything about his family. So yeah, it was really tough for him having babies at home, which then also, when you read the diary, right, when he's away in the war and then gets incarcerated, having 6 kids at home, and they don't know what happened to him. He doesn't know if they're still alive. So it's quite a tough story.
Do we know how he felt with the outbreak of war in 1939?
I'm not sure if there's a documentation where he says, oh, this is a bad thing. 1939 still said like this, the Wehrmacht still had enough men, enough soldiers to fight the wars, 2 or 3 wars that they fought. But eventually they would run out of men, of course, as we all know, right? And so from 1939 to, I think, 1941 or 42, he tried to kind of hide at work, where his bosses always say, no, we need him. He's so essential to our business. We cannot have him drafted. And it worked until 1941, 42, and they didn't have a chance to say no. But I don't recall a document or statement where he says, it's really bad now.
What was he doing at that point? Was he still working as a blacksmith? So he'd be key metal worker.
He was a construction worker, blacksmith at the time, and company that did steel constructions, yes.
So he'd be a key wartime worker until, I guess, 1941, the invasion of Russia, and as you say, suddenly the Wehrmacht needs more men. It's slightly curious that at 1941 they're thinking, well, we'll take him on even though he's been imprisoned as a communist and might not be a type of character we need in the army because he's not indoctrinated.
You make a good point, because in the early 30s, when they recruited men for the future war, they deemed communists and even social democrats, whether they were in prison or not eligible, not good enough to serve in our army. So luckily, well, if you were in prison and tortured as a communist, it's not a good thing. But then, of course, you're not worthy to serve in the army. But then eventually they came back and said, who's still around and who's still alive? Oh, you need to go.
Because he's posted around to the aircraft unit. And I wondered if, and I guess we won't know this unless a piece of paper falls out some archive somewhere, why he was chosen for an anti-aircraft unit. Because he's still a relatively young chap at this point, must be in his early 30s. You would have thought they would be needing people like him as infantry at the front, not necessarily manning anti-aircraft guns.
That's a good question. I do not know the answer why he ended up in Munich versus going. Well, his elder brother, Kurt, and Otto, they both. Well, one had to serve at the Russian front. That's where he got killed. I still have that little piece of paper that they sent home, the original saying sorry, And his brother, Otto, I always mix them up. Ended up, I think, in Romania, somewhere in the Eastern Europe, was killed there. I do not know why Fritz ended up in Munich. Luckily for him.
It could be just lack of the luck. It's the way it falls out. I thought, I wonder if it's because he was a communist, they put him in the anti-aircraft unit, or was it just luck? It could.
Well, he was very good with his hands. So it was very practical. So if they had to fix something, and during the diary, he writes very often, if some damage, he was there, try to fix something, whatever it means, with the women when the kitchen was flooded or something, right there. And maybe with this unit that something goes wrong, because he also writes in a diary about the bad quality of the equipment that they had to use. So they had to either engage the women. Women said, I have no idea how to fix this. So he was there.
Does he find army life difficult? The regimentation, being, serving in the military for I guess, a conflict that he doesn't necessarily believe in, but at the same time, they are being bombed. So there's an element of self-defense. He's not aggressive. I don't know how he ever felt about the war, if he really reflected upon it within the family beyond the diary.
Definitely he was not a fan, because, of course, the way you grew up and knew about what's going on in the country. But at the same time, it's in a sense, destiny or fate. Nothing you can do. So now I have to deal with it. Of course, I have to deal with the range of characters wherever I go. Any company, any army unit, of course, the range of characters. So, and then he realizes early on, well, it's about survival now, right? So make it work and, have some relationships in terms of the interaction with fellow soldiers or the superiors and make it work and survive, basically. So from that perspective, that's how he dealt with the war. But I know, and I'll share with you an anecdote, which he touches upon in the book slightly, half a page, that tells you how he really feels about war, per se. So I don't know if you recall the situation when he says he gets called in by a superior officer, 1945 January or so. And the guy says, well, I have an order here. You need to report 2 days from now at the so-called Feldgericht, which is a court-martial local court. And when you hear Feldgericht in German, in your mind translates to, I'm done. They're going to shoot me for whatever, the charges. And his officer says that some news got to them that you talk bad about the war or something. What? Okay. I mean, it's 1945. Everyone kind of sensed it's coming to an end, or even at the end of 44. So he goes there, rides the bicycle, and 2 days later he reports to the field court. In between, since sometimes funny, in the document that I have, he said, first I went to the farmers in town, in a little village that I knew from way back, and had some nice breakfast, and then I reported to the Feldgericht. So he reports to the Feldgericht, and then, of course, he picture the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, all these. I don't know how many judges were in the room, but just picture, so very serious. So they ask him two questions. First of all, here's the charge. In 1944, in October, someone basically snitched on you, so-and-so, and said you talked bad about the war, and it's kind of a war crime. Here's my whole, wait, slow down. Oh, I remember the conversation. Yeah, I shared a cigarette with fellow soldiers. We talked about family. But I remember he also was a drunk. So you may not want to believe everything he said. Okay. Oh, and now I remember. Just picture this for a moment. You sit in this chair and there's the court, and maybe an hour later you're dead, right? In his mind, within a split of a second, he's, oh, I remember the conversation. And I have it in writing. It's not in the diary, but I have it in writing. I remember the conversation. Yeah, all I did was I was quoting the Minister of Propaganda, Mr. Goebbels. I had just read the newspaper, the Stürmer or Volks, whatever, the newspaper, and there was a headline, believe it or not. There was a headline. I just quoted the headline. If we want to win the war, we need to conquer Ukraine. That's all I said. Oh, okay. So prove or disprove. Can you imagine? You just made it up on the spot. And then the second question comes. So, Mr. Häber, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? No, absolutely not. So can you imagine that? So that's 1945, so in February. So, Germany was destroyed. So they were not able to get his paperwork from Zwickau to Munich to disprove his lie, right? So there was no paperwork. So they had to believe him. And he was so convincing in the way he presented himself. They said, okay, dismissed. Can you imagine? So then he went back to his officer a few days later, and he reports back to his officer and goes into the room and said, oh, you're still alive. Interesting. Tell me. And then so he tells him the story, and they closed the door and were laughing about it. But then his officer said, be very careful. It's just maybe a few more weeks or months. Be very careful.
He experiences so much of these almost things that you've sort of heard anecdotally. It's quite remarkable. The other thing which you actually you briefly touched upon there was when he's writing the diary, what kept coming back was he kept reflecting on food, but food when they were serving. It's the bit when he's talking about being in the anti-aircraft unit was quite good because they had the daytimes free, at which point they could help with the farms, at which point they could get more food.
Correct. So they built a relationship with the farmers in town. And there's also the scene that he describes when he get incarcerated by the Americans. They put him on the trucks and they drive through the same villages. And the farmers throw the loaves of bread onto and see if the train forgot, and they try to catch him. But if there's a soldier lucky enough being at the edge of the truck, catching the bread, would not share. Say, hey, no, it's my,
So how did he cross over into being a prisoner of war? That's often the dangerous time for many men, how they are captured. And I guess he's an anti-aircraft unit. I'm not sure if they had orders to allow themselves to be captured or even be used in a ground capacity.
In the diary, he writes very detailed about that day, April 28, 29, forgot. So basically he describes the morning they're there with the unit, and they see the American tanks rolling down the hill on the other side of the valley, it's a small village. And they had their white flag ready, but they were waiting for some orders from the command center saying what to do. Should we run away? Should we stay? Should we fight? It didn't come through because everyone was just scrambling and trying to run away. And of course, some of his fellow soldiers said, I'm out of here. My grandfather said, nope, I'll face it and I'll keep my uniform. I'm not going to try to hide it. Then he decides to make breakfast for everyone. So the local father, hey, give me some eggs, give me some bread. So he makes breakfast for everyone who was still around. Pancakes and eggs. Said, take it easy. And then there's this one scene. He and one of his fellow soldiers, they take 80 bottles of schnapps and bury them in the woods. And then in the diary says, well, whenever it's convenient, we'll come back and get them. But he has this humor in him. Just take it easy, be a little bit ironic about, let's see what happened and deal with it to the best I can. So yeah, he describes that day, and then of course they come and then take him and put him on the truck, and then off he goes.
Well, there's a certain practicality to it as well. I don't know what's coming. By this time, they haven't always had enough food and rations. So they sit down and go, well, rather than hand over what we've got to the Americans, we'll eat, have a good meal, and then we will organize our own incarceration. We're not going to run away and, we'll just, they kind of implement their own surrender, if that makes sense, and have that final supper together, which after that point, I guess they're casting themselves to the four winds because they don't know what's what's going to happen to them. So what do the Americans do with them when they round them all up, collect them up? I mean, does he literally walk across?
No, they were just waiting. It was in the middle of the village where they were stationed. And I think he said, or someone had said, we have this white flag and we're not going to fight because we don't want to get killed. So yeah, the Americans come in and walk over to them and say, okay, give me your guns. And then they put them on trucks and then drove them to the next kind of place where they would, bring all the soldiers together and then decide what to do with them, whether they drive them off or keep them there for a while. And then in very detailed, I think they end up in another village in a barn kind of building, hundreds of soldiers. He ends up upstairs and then the fights over the food. And he's also a nice guy. So he shares his loaf of bread and his bottle with the water. He gives it to other soldiers and they steal it, of course. And they say, then. So yeah, then he goes through this journey of pure survival.
I mean, this is right at the end of the war, the end of April 1945, and there are thousands, tens of thousands of German soldiers surrendering. I'm intrigued to know what was that camp experience like in those first, I guess, early weeks of the war for him. What did he discuss? What did he talk about in those? Because I'm not completely sure even if the Americans were even the Allies, not just the Americans were. In his instance, he's surrendered to the Americans. But if the Allies were even prepared for such large amounts of prisoners.
So what he does is either he meets a fellow soldier that he served with and they kind of stick together, trust each other, or there might be other fellow soldiers that he meets, but he has a good sense of, I can trust the guy to survive together, because alone, there's no way you do that. So when they get to those camps, the first thing is, well, it's April, May, so it's still wet, cold. It's on sunny days, early spring, but it's still wet and cold. So the first thing is to keep your clothes that you have and find something to cover for night. So they find cardboards in the camp to cover. And they actually, basically lay together in this little piece of on earth, right? Two of them just to warm each other, basically, and have a cardboard on top of that. And then they share the responsibilities. Once or twice a day, there's the call for, hey, food, pick up your food, get in line. And so there's food, but then there's also water. So they kind of split up and say, so I'll go for the water, line up there. I go for the food, and we'll meet again here. It worked for some days and weeks, but sometimes they lost each other. There's thousands of other soldiers. Oh, whatever happened, he ran away or we lost each other. Then you start fresh, building another relationship or try to survive. So yeah, it's purely survival first few days.
What I was surprised at was how sparse those, I'm not even sure you could really call them prison camps. They're almost just sort of fenced in enclosures where they're left to get on with it as best they could, because the Allies can't cope with the vast amount of prisoners that are all coming in. So the facilities aren't there. You don't read about, which I guess, it's the enemy. From the Allied point of view, it's the enemy and you're not particularly worried about them, and the Allies won, so they don't write necessarily about that experience, which is why I think it's so interesting, reading his experience, if that makes sense.
Well, there's another experience that he writes about. It is when he's on a truck and they drive him to the next town or next camp kind of thing, and driven by Americans. So the truck stops, and then the two drivers, or the driver and the co-driver, the two Americans went out to take a pee or something, but then they pour sugar into the street for whatever reason, and do not share it with the prisoners. So, and of course, made a lot of soldiers on the back of the truck very angry. He was treated well, comparably probably to other prisoners of war by the Americans. And then, of course, when he ends up in Metz in France, also by the French, overall, he was never, ever hit or anything. Actually, the bigger challenge for him or any soldier was that at least Americans reestablish the ranking order within the camp. So the German officers, again, had to make the calls and ordered people around. So some of them were still nice about it, because given the situation, others were still the same. Officers versus soldiers, don't talk to me. Yeah.
Did he write about how much he was aware of what was happening beyond the wire? Did they know what had happened to their families, and his brothers and things? Or are they literally living in a vacuum of information?
So the last time he went home before he got incarcerated was late 1944, like a long weekend. And then he came back. Until he got the letters from home, he didn't know whether his family had survived. At least in Metz, maybe the camp before that, there were always people who knew about it. There was a newspaper, the local newspaper of some kind, or some news that the Allied forces shared with the prisoners. So there was some news, at least, how bad it is or what's going on. But he didn't know until he found a way to send a letter home. It's not in the diary, but it's on the website. So if I can maybe also recommend going to the book project website. He talks about that story. So he's in Metz, in France. Forgot the exact day it was. It was 1945 or 1946 already. So he meets an American journalist who comes to the camp to report on it or for whatever reason. So he talks to the guy and said, hey, and you can listen to my grandfather on the website, how he talks about this, subtitles there. He said, hey, you're a journalist. Let me tell you how bad the Americans are and the French. Every week they tell us you can go home and you can't, and you're back and forth. It's frustrating. Okay, write about this. Hey, by the way, you're going to Munich. Yeah? Just picture this. It's, Europe is totally destroyed. Hey, you journalist, you go to Munich, right? Yeah. Go to this church, find Pfarrer, the priest, Huber, not Häber, Huber, and give him this letter. And then ask the priest to send it to my family in Zwickau, in Saxony. And he knew the guy because he had a relationship like with the farmers, right? He had built this relationship with this priest. Imagine, like you would say, send someone with a letter to London or to whatever city, right? And then send a letter to Bernd in Phoenix. Make it happen. And sure enough, then after a few weeks and months, his family in Zwickau got a letter from the priest telling them, well, he's alive. He's in this camp in Metz. And then they sent a letter to him weeks later. So he receives that letter. Just a phenomenal way of being courage about it.
It also reflects that moment at the end of the war where there's that months of confusion, who's alive. There's a mass transit of people going east, west and everywhere. The borders, I guess, are starting to come up. There's men in camps. Nobody quite knows who's where and things. It's, and that letter gets through. He must be just one of the hundreds of thousands of people wondering if their family or friends are still alive there.
Yeah, there's a great anecdote that comes with it. He touches upon a little bit in a diary. So that has to do with my father. So my father was home. He was 14 years at that time, or 15 years. And actually, my father got really lucky. You probably know at the end of World War II in Germany, totally had run out of men. So they recruited the young boys, 15 and oldest, to fight the Russians or, still win the war. But there was this rule, you had to be at least 15 to fight, to join it's called the Volksstrom, right? So my dad was 14, luckily, so he didn't end up. So therefore, of course, my dad survived. So the anecdote with the letter is, so they get this letter from Fritz, finally, and they respond, and my father writes part of the letter back to his father, said, Dad, I have a question. I'm now 15 years old and I have to make a decision what I should do in life. What should I become? I have 3 choices. I need your help to decide. First, should I become a miner like my brothers? Zwickau is very famous for black coal mining. Should I become a miner? Second, my teacher in school tells me I should become an actor because I'm really good at these school plays. Okay. And then someone told me I'm working now for an agency, a news agency, Russian, German news agency, and they think I'm pretty good with language. So maybe I should become a journalist. Okay. So he sends this letter off. Weeks later, and Fritz writes about it and tells his wife really strongly, miner? Absolutely not. Not Herbert. No, he's not strong enough. He should not go to become a miner. Actor? Forget it. What the heck? So do the journalist thing. Go for it. So and therefore, that put my father on a path to eventually end up going to Berlin in 1950, 51, and become a member of the Communist Party and ended up a Politburo member of the Communist Party in 1985. So that sets his political career for the rest of his life. Not minor, not actor, but journalist, politician. And in 2020, when I visited my dad, he had a few more months to live. I visited him, spent a whole week with him, said basically goodbye. And that was the visit when he handed me over the original diary from Fritz. Well, look, I have this. You want it? Sure. And I was finally doing the connection with the diary and started the project. And I found the reference to the letters and the extra documentation that I have. And I sent it back to my dad. And just a few weeks before he passed away, I was able to close that loop that his dad decided what he should become in life. And I remember he was in tears when we talked about it.
That diary, it started quite early as a prisoner of war. Do we know why he was writing it or who he was writing it for? Because I read it and I thought, is he writing it for himself or is he writing it as a sort of I want to get this out, or was he writing it with the idea that he might be at some point be able to hand it on to the next generation?
You mind if I read from the book?
No, feel free.
In his letter to his wife, to his family, and it starts with this letter. And this is the quote, "I dedicate these pages to my wife and my children, of whom I hope are still alive, and whom to find well when I return from captivity. May these lines serve my wife in the future as a compensation for the long time during which she knew nothing about my well-being, and for the children to serve as an example of how human destinies can get easily mixed up." So basically he was documenting, writing, not knowing if he ever gets back to his family. Hopefully at least they get this paper.
Because it's an intriguing diary, because it's part diary, part memoir. And in fact, his reminiscences on the camp are a lot less than kind of his explaining how he got there.
You're right. So it's a diary and a memoir in a sense, because he goes back in time, right? During the diary, writing it, his apprenticeship time in the 1920s, his experience in the 1930s, his military career. So he details all of those. It's in the middle of, okay, I feel like writing about my life now. Okay. And that's the memoir. And then he goes on with the diary about daily life in the camp. Yeah.
Right. I think we better take a break. Hello, listener. We'll be back in a moment. You do wonder how he's spending his time in the camp, but he apologises for not writing for a while. But I think it's interesting. He feels he has to apologise to something that no one's reading. He's kind of writing it almost to himself in that respect. I'm sorry, I haven't written for a while. Well, if you hadn't put that, no one would have realised, because you've got the diary and haven't been able to hand it on.
And it keeps him motivating in terms of motivation to continue to maybe one day, because there's always the rumor in the camp, next week you go home. Oh, yeah. Oh, not me this time. There's always this hope. Oh, another month. And then you see someone leaving, for whatever reason, that I keep him motivated to write. But then at the same time, also the hope that he can complete the diary so someone can really get the full story.
I hadn't thought of it that way. It's almost it's an idea of hope. He's writing it down, hoping that he can hand it on. So if I've written it, I've got to be able to, I can hand it on personally, kind of thing. How long did he spend as a prisoner of war?
16 months. So he was captured in April 45 and went home in August 1946.
And how he returns to East Germany, which is communist controlled.
Oh, correct, Zwickau, which is an interesting side note. So Zwickau was first captured by the Americans. The Russians came to Berlin. The city of Zwickau was first conquered or captured by the Americans. But then, of course, the Russians and the Americans traded pieces of land. So then they retreated, and then the Russians moved in, which was a good thing. And my dad told me about it. It was the second wave of the Red Army coming into town, starting to fix things and do things, versus the first wave of the Red Army soldiers who did some things we all know, which was not pretty.
When he returns home to communist-controlled East Germany, how does he fit in? How does he find his family? Is everything destroyed? I mean, what is home like?
I think the home was still there. So the building, because Zwickau was not necessarily a military target. So in terms of factories for military equipment and stuff. So overall, I think Zwickau was still intact, although it became later the center, or was already in the 1920s and 30s, the center of car building. Famous, the four rings of Audi started actually in Zwickau. Of course, the factories were destroyed, but at least the city was intact. So yeah, he was coming back to his family and started, living his life. And I remember my dad telling me they had to run out at night to the farmers' fields and steal some potatoes or from the trains coming through. So they had to survive as a family. And then he started to get back into mining, or he started later working for a brewing company. Maybe that came later in the 50s or 60s. And he had several jobs to, have some earning from, feed the family.
How does he feel about returning to communist occupied? Well, it was not, if they're Russian occupied, I guess it's in theory it's handed over to the Germans to run by the East German Communist Party. Does that suit him, being a communist at some point himself?
I don't think there was ever a question for him to go to the West, because first of all, there was his family with 6 kids. So you cannot just say in 1946 move 6 kids unless you have really a desperate need or desire, right? So that was reason one. Second was he still believed in communism. So he came back, he experienced the war, said, look, this is what fascism or capitalism is about. So maybe we can start a new society, start fresh, basically building something new. But already in the mid-1950s, he faced the first challenge, because then, I have to back this up, the story that comes now, he touches very little bit in the diary when he was ordered to become a member of a shooting squad. And there's actually on the website, the one when he talks about it, one scene, how he ended up there. Well, basically there was someone a deserter. There's 2 different stories. A deserter who wanted to run away and
AWOL, absent without leave.
Yeah. And it was a crime, right? Basically. So basically, or the second story goes, there was a French prisoner who stole a loaf of bread or something. So whatever the exact reason was, he was ordered with 30 or so other men, soldiers. Hey, you, get your gun. There's this guy shooting squad. We need to execute someone. So he describes that as a member of the shooting squad. The interesting piece in the interview that I conducted with him in 1990, he tells me a little bit about the details, what happened there. It's not in the book. He says, well, half of the squad members get real bullets, but you don't know if you have the real bullet in your magazine. And the other half gets the blanks, but they don't tell you. So basically you get the order, you aim and you shoot, but you don't know if your bullet kills the guy or not, which I found fascinating that they did this. The guilt of killing, of course, if it's a battle and you kill someone, but in this case, so he could walk away, and it was the only person he killed ever, during the war. Anyway, so he was a member of that shooting squad. In the 1950s, according to some documentation, a French delegation comes to Zwickau for whatever reason, and someone realizes his face, saying, you were a member of that shooting squad, weren't you? So, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And eventually his own comrades of the Communist Party went after him as a reason to get rid of him, because my grandpa was not the quietest person. Sometimes he criticized a lot of people. Sometimes he couldn't, deal with a lot of characters. So he was not a quiet person. And some people liked him. Some people hated him. You know how it is in any group of people or company. So now they had a reason to really go after him. Say, wait, what? And went through some paperwork, found some references. So they kicked him out of the Communist Party a year later because of that. So there was this 1950s, still early on, his experience, his desire, hey, we need a new society, start fresh, communism, socialism, whatever we call it. And here he gets kicked out of the Communist Party. And for the rest of his life, that haunted him.
Did he still feel himself a communist, even after being removed from the party?
Yes. He tried to cope with it, saying maybe it's just a kind of a glitch or an oversight, and because it's this group of people who hate me. It was interesting. My dad started his career in the 1950s in Berlin as a member of the Central Committee of this Communist Party, then became a Politburo member. And it haunted my dad as well in his files. It's a long story. His father, my grandfather, always tried to ask his son, can you help me to get cleared of all of this? It never worked out until the wall came down, 1990s, reunification. Eventually, he got cleared basically of any crime, and they apologized for kicking him out. But it haunted him the whole life.
He came across as a principled, forthright sort of person when you read the diary, because there's that piece, isn't there, where he, and I can't quite remember what happens, he writes to the camp newspaper. He's complaining about the political tone of the camp newspaper. And you thought, well, here's a man who's put his head above the parapet to tell people what he thinks when he could just shut up and keep his head down.
Well, that proves he couldn't sit still and just let things by. And it's an interesting point with this anecdote is, of course, he describes and writes about the various situations of his fellow soldiers in the camp. So some had totally given up life. I don't care. Whatever happened to me, so be it. Maybe they survive or they don't. Some of them were still believing. What? We lost the war? No way. No, I don't think. Maybe it's just some little glitch, kind of totally brainwashed. Still, right? Brainwashed. And then some soldiers thought, oh, well, they should treat us as Germans, as good prisoner of war. What the heck? Why don't we have to get in the stake? And, and then the ranks. And so he realizes this is the range of characters he deals with. And the publication of this article, it's when he realized how ready some people are with facing the truth. Here's what it is. We need to, and he writes in this article about, we have to face it, but we have to face it in a sense, we need to survive and maybe start something new with the new generation. And he got this, pushback.
He's remarkably pragmatic, oddly, it comes across in the diary. He's not necessarily ideological so much as just pragmatic about life and living with other people and doing your best that you can with your other man. How did you feel about the fall of communism, which that's kind of the last big thing that happens in his life? 89, then a wall comes down, and he was a admitted communist in the 30s. Went to prison for it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I never had a chance to talk with him about how he felt after 1989 or 1990. I think he was already set in his mind, so this is what my life was about. He was in his 90s at that time, or late 80s. Communism, it's done, or was the wrong thing. I
guess if he dies in 1998, I'm not sure how much his life would have directly been affected by the collapse of the wall. I guess we're looking at it now from whenever we are, 30 years later, and it's a big thing that happens. But I can't remember, and I obviously wasn't living in Germany, how much of it was a big thing, the wall coming down, but I can't recall how much life changed. Certainly from the British perspective, the headline was the wall came down, and I remember very clearly but then it was over. But I assume you're in East Germany, things changed, but I'm not sure the pace of change that would have affected him.
I can speak out of my own personal experience. So that was a big change. First of all, no one expected it, that it would come down that quick. And to the luck of everyone, it was a peaceful thing. So there was no, the Russian tanks come in again and all of that. A lot of people may not know there were 500,000 Russian soldiers stationed in this small little piece called East Germany with their tanks ready to. So no one knew in November, December 1989 what they would do. Luckily, I have to say, Gorbachev was in charge. So he did not feel like, even though his, generals, the Red Army or Russian Army generals said, oh, we need to, and, all kinds of characters was in any group. So luckily, there was a very peaceful thing. But the change for me personally, it took about 3 years to really realize what that new or old system is about, capitalism, to adjust. Oh, for example, you can lose your job now. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. So I prevented it. I, applied for jobs in an IT company, American IT company, which brought me to Phoenix, or filling out tax returns. Oh, you can get money back. Oh, that's cool. Let's try. Little things like this. And the final piece is also, I'm a music buff. I grew up with very good music in East Germany, but there was really almost no chance to get records, like, Rollings, you name. Of course, there was Black Market, and they would release some records. You would listen on the radio, but the vast of music stuff out there, I had no idea. Of course, when the wall came down, and you may also recall that every East German was considered a German. So we're not East officially, right? So every East German, you go to a bank in Berlin, wherever you go, you show your ID, East German ID, you get 100 Deutschmarks. They call it the welcome money. So every East German got 100 Deutschmarks. So what did I do with the 100 Deutschmarks? I went to a record store and spent it all. And it was overwhelming. I only have 100 Deutschmarks. I want all these records. But it took me about 3 years to really adjust and figure out how should I deal with all of this, with the change and political change, economical change. If I may just add to this, so my grandfather Fritz, so he was in his 80s. So there was just, focusing on family. And, big family is always something, kids, grandkids to deal with. But it really also affected my father, also his son, my father, who, as I mentioned, he became a Politburo member, right? So that means that's it's kind of the inner circle of government in the Communist Party. So he was pulled in by the general secretary at the time in 1985, but he was kicked out 18 months later because they thought he's a spy. He's spying for other. He said, charged him with treason. Long story short, so he got kicked out, and then he was a persona non grata for many years. But when the war came down in the 90s, in 95, he gets charged twice over the course of the next 9 years with the killings at the Berlin Wall. So he had to face court for about 9 years and deal with that. So that really impacted his life because he was also already done, because the old system. But hey, just want to enjoy my retirement. And here comes the accusation. So he had to go through 2 trials. The first one, he was acquitted. The second one, he was found guilty. It's another whole dimension of family history.
Oh, it's remarkable how, it has all touched your life, and it all sort of stems from Fritz's, I guess, his early membership of the Communist Party and that moment in time when 1933 he gets imprisoned, and you can see it in his diaries that being handed on to you.
Angus, can I ask for one more thing? I don't know, whoever is listening or diving into this story. In my mind, I also would like to see this diary or the memoir turned into a movie project. So I've already reached out to a movie industry, people in Germany, here, and trying to figure out, because my pitch is whoever plays my grandfather in the leading role will win the Oscar, of course. So I would love to see if there's anyone out there who might want to help turning this into whatever movie, a film, or maybe a multi-episode series on Netflix, who knows?
It would make a good limited series on Netflix, when they do those four episodes of something, because you'd really be able to let it breathe and explain. Because of the eras that his story spans, you've got 3 or 4 very nice episodes of Weimar Germany, Hitler's Germany, the war, post-war. It could be a really significant piece of historical drama.
There could be, if you compare, of course, I don't claim compare, but Isabel Allende, famous writer, her books most of her books span at least decades of family history in the Spanish Civil War or something, goes from 1910 on. So to your point, so a similar span of experience of perspectives of lives in different situations. Yeah.
Very good. Well, folks, if you have any thoughts on turning Fritz's diary and story into a film, do get in touch. You can find Bernd via the website dedicated to his grandfather, 16 months as a POW.com. That's 16 months as a POW.com. The website is well worth a visit for more information about Fritz. And if you're interested in the diary, the book is Fritz Häber, The Complete Diary, 16 Months in an American POW Camp. I'll include all the relevant links in the show notes and on the website. Bernd, thank you again for joining me and sharing your family's story. And folks, don't forget, if you have enjoyed this and would like to support the podcast, you can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/WW2 Podcast. Those small monthly contributions really do help me keep the show going. Well, that is all for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.